So we are almost 3 weeks into season one, and we got to talk about classes and the tier list for them. Which classes are on top? Which classes are speed farming faster? Which classes are tackling the end game at an amazing pace? Now, I will be going through all the builds soon, but I still have to go ahead and flush my understanding about all the builds, so we'll be doing that video in a little bit. However, the tier list here. Oh man, is a couple of classes just absolutely dominating the mid to late game speed farming. And then when you get to tier 100, well, there's a lot of classes that are actually showing up and doing some crazy things. With that said, we're going to rate the speed farming. What I consider speed farming is like 1 to 70 nightmare dungeons and just going through and trying to min-max your gear, trying to level up. Maybe you're like level 70 or so, trying to get to 100. That is what I consider speed farming. And we're actually going to rate these on a 1 to 5 scale because some classes are, well, really good. They're both really good and they could have S tier. And perhaps I'll do 2 different versions, one with ranking them 1 to 5 and then the S, A, B, C, D version. With that said, let's start off with that speed farming. And guys, I think no one is surprised here. The rogue is still dominating speed farming, and as I mentioned in my previous version, this hasn't really changed at all. One thing that's really nice about speed farming on the rogue actually is a lot of builds, as do generally every build in the game, but a lot of builds with the rogue really benefit from the barber. And with the addition of the barber shadow damage giving you infinite energy, you could speed farm even faster than you were able to before with so much more AoE. And to be honest, a lot of other classes can do that as well, such as, well, the druid. The druid is actually speed farming almost as fast as the rogue, and in some situations, if you have the proper build, although it takes a little bit while, a lot more difficult to get that build going, you could go even faster than the rogue compared to some of the rogue's builds. Although the rogue, I think with the twisting blade, still comes out a little bit on top. The druid though is crazy fast. Pulverize is like one-shotting with the barber I've seen. The lightning storm, really crazy, just AoE damage out the wazoo. Werewolf, tornado. There's actually a lot of movement in the druid, and that's something that's really important when you're considering speed farming. Like the rogue has the leaps, the dashes, right? Druid's got straight up movement speed, and that's a really big bonus to help you out speed clearing. So actually, this is something that surprised me, but earlier I would have put the druid maybe like 3 or maybe even 4. I usually stuck to around 3 and found like the necro to be a little bit better, but man, the druid is really fast. Next up, we have the necro, and the necro's nerfs to bone spear actually didn't hit them nearly as hard as you would have expected. The I guess nerfs to the nightmare dungeon kind of put bone spear to a place where it's like, yeah, it's basically just as good as it was before, and you're still one-shotting everything, which is really cool. And the bone spear is really fast. You just crush through everything super quickly, and you're allowed to, and this is where it differentiates from the sorcerer, because the sorcerer is also killing things quickly as well, and it's fast and has some mobility. The difference is necromancer could speed farm higher tiers faster versus the sorcerer, and that's why the necro's on top. Bone spear though is the main version of this that's actually doing good work. Sever necro, blight necro, even the infinimists aren't they're just not as fast. But infinimists can give you a lot of survivability with the necro, and that's really nice. So if you want to push even higher and perhaps go a little bit slower, you can do that. So you have a little bit of options on the necro. Then we have the sorcerer, and by nature of barb being barb, we have barb last. Sorcerer, honestly, it has a couple builds that can surpass the necromancer. However, the key with the sorcerer is that it doesn't do as much damage as the necro, and that's super important to note. If the sorcerer was like comparable DPS to the necro later on, the sorcerer actually clears quicker, but when we're considering speed farming, as I mentioned, we're getting gear, we're trying to min-max, we're trying to level up, and the necro is able to do that faster due to their higher DPS. However, the sorcerer is honestly very comparable. So if I were to go ahead and say, is sorcerer bad? Actually, not really. The sorcerer's been clearing pretty quickly, and you might be like, oh, well, look, they're at the bottom of the list. Well, that's just because, well, you got to rank each class at one after another, and I'll change this to the SABCD list in just a moment, just to give you guys kind of a better impression of where these shake up in the grand scheme of the game. But as for barbarians are actively slower, like way slower, like significantly slower. Even Whirlwind and Hoda end up being quite a bit slower than the Necro and Sorcerer. So like if I were to put this in the, as I said, A, B, C, D version, no one's going to end up, even in the C or D, we're going to have this end up happening. Sorcerer, Necro in the same tier, Rogue, Druid in the same tier, and Barbarian in its tier just underneath these other four. Barbarian, still very, very good, still can clear very, very fast, and actually, if you're considering the like mid game, well, Barbarian would actually jump up ahead of these two, in my opinion, because the build can actually be online much quicker. Problem with the Barbarian right now, though, is, well, their just damage is kind of not as high as the Sorcerer and Necro, while also you don't have the mobility that the Sorcerer does. Oftentimes the Sorcerer is a little bit faster, and the Necro just has far more DPS. So you kind of just have like a worse Necro DPS and also worse mobility than the Sorcerer. So it kind of puts like you in the middle between these two, and it's just kind of mediocre. But you know, walking Arsenal, maybe with the buffs, you got a little bit of better options. We're doing this video before we have the new patch notes live. We're going to see if those changes really change the list. I don't really think that they will, but that's going to be the speed farming tier list. Let's jump into the Endgame Pushing tier list. So where has everyone shaped up today, or I guess over the past 3 weeks, for the Pushing tier list? First off, I want to talk about what is pushing. Like, what do I mean when I say that? Because a couple of people have been asking. What I mean by that is we are trying to push the higher tier nightmare dungeons, tier 80s, tier 90s, and of course, penultimately, the tier 100 nightmare dungeon completions. I am not considering Uber Lilith. Uber Lilith is a completely different form of content than the nightmare tier 100, okay? And oftentimes you could just go straight DPS, burst out the Lilith, but that doesn't necessarily work in nightmare tier 100s. You could easily do Uber Lilith if you build the correct build for her, but it's not really worth farming if you decide to do so. Even tier 100s are not worth farming. It's literally just there for the kind of completion sake, unless you are very, very min-maxed, and then you can potentially farm it. And that is also kind of going to be a factor. How fast can you do tier 100s? Can you do them easily, etc.? And with that said, well, number one, Druid. Druid still remains number one in my opinion. And that is mainly due just to how much synergy and actually how much survivability their builds actually have. So much damage reduction within their skills, and that really, really helps them out in just being able to crush it easily. Add that to the amount of damage that you can pump out with Werewolf NATO, and actually a breakout build in my opinion. The Pulverized Druid got a lot better with this season, and they're just really, really solid. So absolutely crushing tier 100s very, very amazingly. Next up, we have the Rogue at number 2. Now, this one, as I mentioned in my list before, I'd actually potentially kind of change them out with the number 3 spot if the Rogue didn't have more potential in terms of the amount of versatility it has tackling tier 100s, right? You have a lot of options, which allows you to do multiple different tier 100s, much easier than the number 3 spot, although the number 3 spot is pretty close. And really, Twisting Blades, the rapid fire version, really, really solid. The AoE potential with the Barber is really helping out there. Heck, even Death Trap and Barrage are making it up towards those tier 100s I've seen. Really, really solid class, and probably the most versatile class in the game. If I were rating these on like how many options you have, Rogue would be number 1, no question in my mind. Rogue is just the most powerful overall class in terms of how many options you have, but in terms of like specifics, you know, like, oh, can you specifically do this? Well, the Druid comes out a little bit on top, and actually the number 3 spot, the Necro, has a little bit more DPS than the Rogue in fact, a lot of scenarios, but it's only one build, and that is Bone Spear. Bone Spear is still top of the charts. It's still amazing. It's still really good for pushing. Still absolutely wrecks everything. Really, really solid build. And my favorite part about this, and this also applies to speed farming, although a little bit less so, the auto consumption of corpses is so good for the late game tier 100s. I mean, you just walk in there, you're perma CCing, you're perma DPSing. You don't have to worry about misclicking your stupid corpses. Oh my goodness, necromancers are absolutely amazing comparatively to the last season, despite them getting massively nerfed in their best build. Now, this is all under a caveat, and that is that Bone Spirit, Bone Spirit, Bone Spear. The Necromancer still needs a lot of health, and I don't want to understate that. You know, Sever, Bloodlance. I don't think Bloodlance is still very good, although some people find it to be decent. Shadow Necromancers. You have your Summoner options like Blood Surge. These builds still need a little bit of help comparatively, and some of them more so than others, okay? Bone Spear is still far better than those options. At a number 4 here, this one's a tough one, but I'm actually going to have to put Barbarian ahead of Sorcerer. Barbarian does have the Whirlwind, does have the Hoda builds, and those two, I think, are the strongest for tier 100 pushing. And unfortunately, with the Sorcerer actually does less damage when you start to scale up to this point, because the Barbarian, although it is a little bit slower, actually does oftentimes more DPS than the Sorcerer while being a little bit slower, but you also have a lot more options for damage reduction and survivability, and that's key, because the Sorcerer has a really hard time living through these dungeons, as does a couple of other classes, like the Rogue still struggle a little bit, the Necromancer still struggle a little bit, right? Survivability is always going to be a problem with those classes. Druid and Barb are the kind of the haymakers in terms of survivability, because they are those quintessential, typically melee classes. And well, Barb does not disappoint in terms of how much damage reduction you can build on them and get for your tier 100s. But again, their damage is also a little bit higher, and it still can scale a little bit better. So unfortunately, Sorcerers still at the bottom, and they got a hard nerf with season 1. And it's really disappointing because, you know, previously I don't know, actually, I don't even know where I would put the Sorcerer. Maybe the Sorcerers were just the worst class last season too. I mean, that doesn't seem super surprising to me. You know, Barbarians were still doing some crazy stuff. You know, what I will say about this, though, is Sorcerer has had a couple of bugs going on where they can just annihilate tier 100s at level 80. And I've seen that before, but outside of the bugs, Sorcerers just need some massive, massive help. And I'm hoping that like Chain Lightning or maybe some Fireball options are going to pop up here with this next patch. Although I personally don't find that the buffs did anything to really make Fireball or Chain Lightning like a breakout build. Like, you need a lot of help for these builds, and Chain Lightning, to be fair, did get a decent amount of help. But even if they were to like be comparable to like Ice Shards or like Blizzard builds for Sorcerer, which tend to be the best builds, they're still not even close to like Rogue or Bone Spear or Druid, which is pretty unfortunate, or even the Whirlwind Barbarian, which I find to be a little bit better than all of those as well, or all of the Sorcerer builds as well. If I were to put this in an S, A, B, C, D list, I would have to put Druid and Rogue up here, same as before. Necromancer, Barb, and then Sorcerer. You know what? Actually, I'm gonna have to do this. The Barbarian is noticeably worse than the Necro, and the Barbarian is also notably better than the Sorcerer. There is not a class that is like failing and can't do it, can't like do anything, right? The Sorcerer is just average, it's mediocre, it's not super great. The standout ones for me are Druid and Rogue at the current moment. Man, the Rogue got so much help from the Hearts this season. The Druid as well, actually, you know, kind of a lot of synergy with the Hearts, but also Druid has just been kind of a mainstay in terms of endgame. It's always been super strong. And the Necromancer didn't get nerfed out of its spot, in my opinion. The Barbarian, honestly, the amount of nerfs that they've just done to it have just dropped it a couple tiers, and it's mainly due to season 1 nerfs. Like, Barbarian was ridiculous, okay? And they got nerfed kind of, I would say, to the ground, but they're not actually at the ground. They're like, you know, Sorcerer's like at the ground, and then Barbarian's just a step above. And I think that, honestly, the thing that really needs to be flushed out, because the best builds for these classes, this is kind of where it ends up. So the Barbarian and the Sorcerer probably just needs buffs across the board. Like, nerfing the passives of the Sorcerer, I think, are the opposite of the way that you need to go for the Sorcerer. The Sorcerer needs buffs to their passives, so all builds get better. And then you need to buff individually those builds, like Firewall, Ball Lightning, Arc Lash, Meteor, like Frozen Orb. These builds, I think, just need to be a little bit better. And then, like, For Barbarians, same thing needs to happen. Like Rend, Rupture, Upheaval, these options just need to be a bit better. But you also need to just buff them overall. The Necro has kind of the opposite, which is like their passives are already really good, which is why the bone skills are super good, but you gotta buff the other passives for the other versions, okay? So I guess it's not necessarily opposite problem. But that's kind of why like Rogue and Druid are so strong, is that their core synergies are so good that makes all their builds good. The problem is Necro, Barb, and Sorcerer have specific aspects or specific passives that only specific builds work with, and you don't have that versatility. So if anything, you gotta buff these classes just because they're not as good, but also get some of these bottom tier like garbage gutter feeder builds like up there, because oh my goodness, I mean, have you guys seen someone try to run like a fireball sorcerer or like incinerate sorcerer? It is literally the biggest meme in the world. I've not seen anyone do anything with those builds. I mean, Companion Druid is doing more than Incinerate Sorcerer. It's such a meme, man. Oh boy, don't get me started on Incinerate Sorcerer. It is literally the biggest meme. If Incinerate Sorcerer was on this list, it would just literally just be off. I would just not put it because it's actually a meme. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Let me know if you're enjoying Season 1 still, and if you've actually ended up beating a Tier 100 on any of these classes. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.